No professional photographer would do that.
Yeah. But there are no bracketed photographs shown on the official sequence of photographs produced by NASA. So the famous magazine 40 from Apollo 11 is a compilation of various images from different sequences, different simulations, to create the story that NASA want to sell. There's man on the moon. You can see him. They certainly didn't carry a 250mm Hasselblad lens on Apollo 11.
It is stated quite clearly in March to the Moon. That file's right there.
Yeah, an optical printer is a wonderful thing.
Yeah, it is. It can produce wonderful results. And it can fabricate anything you want. And it would appear to be the original image that you're using, because an optical printer, as the name would imply, is optical. It prints the optical image.
It's really interesting how you can see the original safety film in the original photographs.
Yeah.
But the funny thing is that you would also, eventually, you would get that doubled because you're rephotographing that in the optical printer.
Yeah.
So you would also see safety film or some other film type in the other film that is being rephotographed. You could see that by the handwritten typo that they have on the secondary film, but you don't see safety film or color reversal film or any of that in any of those strips. You don't see that in the original, and you don't see that in the rephotographed film. So where are they getting that film from? Like you said, most likely off the shelf.
So all this talk about special film developed for Apollo, nobody's ever defined what the special part of the film is. I mean, Dave was saying that they were special films. Well, what was special about it? Come on, explain it. Don't just say it. Anybody can say it.
Well, we have the listing on March to the Moon that states exactly what the film was.
Yeah, basically, if it's finer, you can't see the cracks. Can't see the joins. Whoa. No, it's very easy for these parrots to state something, apparently authoritatively, but without providing evidence to back up what they're saying, it means nothing.
And if they would sit down for a few hours and just read the articles on the OWLIS site, they're going to learn something. Not one of them will do it.
They'll sit there and they will find updated files, and NASA is very good at updating their files just to confuse people.
I think it's reasonable to say that NASA or their representatives are watching what we're saying and what we're concluding. And they're saying, oh shit, we got a problem here, guys. Come on, get those files off the website. Put something new up.
It was only one day, overnight. We were looking at that article of Joyce Devers on the OWLIS site, and the next morning it was redacted, and there's now only 4 photographs or 4 paragraphs that are left on that article.
Well, we had to find a new link. They just took it down. That link went dead. And then all of a sudden, all 56 of her documents were gone.
So what we were saying about vacuum affecting film is correct. It does affect film.
They worked for 15 years with one team in a vacuum chamber testing everything if vacuum wasn't a factor.
Of course, it's a standard thing. Of course you're going to test for the conditions you're going to go into. And the conditions include vacuum as well as heat and radiation.
And that's why they have high-altitude film, or else they would be pulling the stock film right off of the shelf.
Yeah.
High altitude's only 12,000 feet again.
What good's that going to do on the lunar surface?
Nothing. It had to be pressurized already.
It pressurized inside the SR-71. That flew at, what, 80,000 feet? So we're talking relatively low pressure, not moon-level pressure, sort of ISS level, up there sort of somewhere. But they still have to pressurize the film, because we know what happens if they don't. It destroys it. It's not the backing it destroys, it's the emulsion. That's the difference. You're quite right to point out the difference, Robert. It's not the backing. That doesn't really make a difference.
They could use saran wrap for the backing.
They needed to have it strong enough to go through the sprockets on the film, on the camera.
Yeah, I understand that, but you could, in theory, use a material like saran wrap. It doesn't matter. It's that emulsion. It's those layers with that chemical in between them that makes the picture.
You cannot harden it. You can't harden it for space. You can't harden it for a vacuum. You can't harden it anything. It is the same. It can't even be duplicated. It cannot be done under any artificial means. That same material is the same as it was when it was created. They make modifications to the grain of it and everything else, the silver nitrates that are put in it and things like that, and to create different levels of it to create a color film. But the emulsion itself, the base emulsion itself, is an animal product, and that's all there is to it.
And it's affected in the same way that everything else is affected on Earth, by pressure.
And it has to remain liquid.
If you take the pressure away, what happens? It affects it.
It's going to evaporate.
You go to space, you take the pressure away, it's affected. I think Tim demonstrated that very clearly when he was talking about the care and use of cinefilm. Cinefilm has to be protected on all occasions from its manufacture to its development. If you get the temperature on the development wrong, you wreck the film.
Yeah, and I found that out the hard way.
What Tim was saying, though, is that the Saturn V rocket is the delivery vehicle. And then you realize that the film is outside of this craft the entire length of time. Out on the outside of the mapping camera and everything that was on the outside of the CSM. It went through from launch, through the atmospheric pressure changes, through the Van Allen belt, through the extreme vacuum, through lighting, and like if it's orbiting around the moon, then it would have to go through a daylight and nighttime cycle.
Well, it's also in barbecue mode, so it's spinning the whole time.
But they couldn't have it in barbecue mode if it's the mapping camera on the moon. Can't be in barbecue mode. Camera has to point straight at the moon, so it's no longer in barbecue mode.
But the service module in which the mapping camera is contained is attached to the lunar modules and the service module. They're all attached together. So if one of them is in barbecue mode, they're all in barbecue mode. It's always been a mystery to me when we see these films allegedly taken above the lunar surface for several seconds at a time, and the position of the camera doesn't change. If it was in barbecue mode, there would be a continual movement of the camera. Camera point would change, but it doesn't.
No, but then they would have to take it out of barbecue mode, and then what would happen? The sun's going to heat up one side, and it's going to be frozen on the other side.
And how did they get that thing to orbit in the exact path so that the mapping camera would do a slice, then the next slice, then the next slice, and the next slice going around the moon? That didn't happen in orbit. That happened in a studio where they had the big arm down and the camera on it and the big giant ball that they had rotating. But the orbit of the craft around the moon, how did they get every square inch of the moon mapped like that? The next orbit is just that much farther down and that much farther down and that much farther down. When you see how they put it all, like you can see the lines where they piece it all together. That didn't happen doing that because it wouldn't work like that, especially the fact that they never got there. But they did that on that big ball with that camera, and we've got the images of that.
It's the magic of film. Do anything to film. You know, you can show gorillas climb the Empire State Building, dinosaurs chasing kids around Jurassic Park. I mean, it's all explained quite well in make-believe Smoke and Mirrors. Some of it may well have been filmed at the Lookout Mountain Laboratory in Laurel Canyon. It doesn't matter where it's filmed.
Downey Studios is a pretty good guess, too.
Downey Studios, Cannon Air Force Base, they were doing a bit of filming down there. They were doing filming all over America and Hawaii and Iceland and all these places where they managed to find suitable rocks. Well, they probably brought most of them back. There's so many holes in the story, and NASA have never managed to explain them legitimately. They won't even answer the question, how did you do it? They said, well, man landed on the moon. How did he do it?
When people say that they did not have the capabilities to fake it and do a full simulation on it, they were right. But they still filmed it anyway. And we can see all of those errors in simulation.
Yeah, it's a good phrase, that, error in simulation. Because as soon as you look out for them, you see them.
Because the error in simulation was buzz coming out the door. because it's a prop. Probably wasn't intentional, but there he is leaning right up against the door frame when there's so-called a console in place in there, because that was just a shell that he was working with.
Yeah.
And nobody caught it. The director didn't say, hey, Buzz, there's supposed to be a console there. They're so busy trying to get the lighting and everything else and all of the other simulated effects that they were trying to put in there, which they could not do. And of course, when you look at when they're picking things up and they drop it, when they're trying to load some dirt into a bag, right, it's falling at Earth's gravitational speed. Those are things that they could not simulate.
No.
The same with the rover. It goes up and the rooster tail coming off hits the air and goes flat.
Yeah, that's what it does. That's happening because there's no air on the moon, we keep being told. No, there isn't.
They couldn't do the simulation. They did not have the technology to do the simulation, but they still went ahead and filmed it anyway. When you realize that, that's when you start to see all of the problems, right? And you see them when they're being held by wires, when they fall down and they're being actually dragged up by the wire, right?
Astronauts you can put onto wires. Equipment you can put onto wires. Sand you cannot put onto wires. The lunar surface, the regolith, we call it sand because it's easy, that will behave in the manner in which it is filmed. If it's filmed on Earth, it falls at Earth's gravity speed. If it's filmed on the moon, it's filmed at moon gravity speed, and they're very different. You can't confuse them. Moon gravity is 1.68 meters per second. Earth gravity is 9.8 meters per second. They're very different.
Not to mention the photoelectric charge that would keep the fine dust simply suspended.
Exactly, yeah. And that does appear in a few images, or it appears to be shown in a few images. I don't know if it is or not, because I don't think anybody got to the moon to take the pictures, for reasons we have explained in interminable detail.
Theories were put in place in the early 1900s by some very brilliant people. The amount of cosmic dust that would have built up on the lunar surface in meters, undisturbed. Cosmic dust over billions of years, right? It could be 15, 20, 30 meters thick.
Probably is in places.
If you take a telescope and look at the moon and you just see the impact crater, an old crater edge, and it's completely filled in and you just see the circle around there, that's all filled in just with dust that has accumulated either from other meteor impacts or cosmic dust over billions of years. And then where do they land? They land in the least active area of the moon, the side that we see. Perfectly smooth, with very few impact craters on it. That's all dust. That'll be the densest part of where the dust has accumulated for those times, right? Not a very good choice to choose for a landing site, then, is it?
Not really, no. Not ideal, which is why the Chinese have gone to the far side. The face of the moon we can't see is called the far side. It's not called the dark side. That's the Pink Floyd album. It's the far side because we can't see it. There's no dark side of the moon except the Pink Floyd album because it rotates around Earth, so it gets sunlight as much as any area of the moon gets as much sunlight as any other area. It just takes longer to do it because the moon rotates in 29 days. All these things have to be taken into account. One point I was thinking about recently was the film you sent about the Indian guy who was talking about the lunar landings, and he explained it very well. He's obviously a very competent YouTube blogger. He was just repeating what many other people have said before. They say, of course the moon landings are real because these people are saying that you should be able to see stars in the photographs, and you can't. Who's ever said that? Who's ever said you should be able to see stars in the photographs? Nobody's ever said that. It's a fabrication. Then you get the flapping flag. Who's ever said the flag is flapping on the lunar surface, therefore it's not real? Who's ever said that? To my knowledge, only one person has made a comment about that, and that was Bill Casing when he wrote his book, We Never Went to the Moon, in 1976. When he was explaining to him what was going on, he said, okay, I got that wrong.
But there's a problem with that. Fox and all the other television institutions They keep showing the flag with the astronauts having their hands on it and twisting it into the surface. What they don't show is the Apollo 15 flag with the astronaut moving past and the flag starts waving.
Jeff Wentzer did his thing on it, right?
But he didn't show the whole thing moving. He did do it, but he was showing it from a different angle. And it was still moving.
It was still moving. And nobody can fully explain why it was moving.
See, this is what gets me, is that people like Brian Pop Robson will say, well, that's because they were in the LEM and they let the air out and the air was rushing past the flag and it started to flap. Well, here's the problem. When you look at the Apollo 15 footage, both astronauts are outside on the surface. So how could they be inside the LEM when they were both outside? And you can see that because one astronaut walks perpendicular to the other one while the second astronaut is walking past that flag. Yep. So there's no persons that are inside of that LEM at that time. It's empty and the door is open.
Well, that creates a controversy with NASA then, because NASA's explanation to the lack of a crater underneath, claiming that the exhaust dissipates so rapidly in a vacuum that it doesn't create a blast crater. Yeah. Well, how could a little blast of air coming out of the door go anywhere if it's going to dissipate as quickly as NASA claims?
As soon as you start examining these explanations put forward by NASA and their supporters and their groupies and their parrots, they all fall apart. I've watched enough of these programs which purport to show how the moon landings were real, by showing that the people who claim that there should be stars in the skies are wrong. I don't know of anybody who's researched Apollo correctly has ever claimed that. If you can name somebody who has said publicly that there should be stars in the photographs visible, I want to hear about it, because to my knowledge nobody has ever said that. Nobody's ever said, oh, there should be stars in the photographs, and there aren't.
The amount of equipment that they had and the variety of lenses and different types of film that they had available, you would think that they would have taken the time to put a camera up to actually shoot a few things in the universe as well as the Earth and everything else and get some beautiful photographs, right? And the only thing they've ever come up with are these composites. The biggest thing is you actually have to be there to be able to do it.
If you're going to land on the moon, the very first thing that a human being would do was get out on the surface and point that camera back at the Earth. But that didn't happen.
You take a picture of the flag and the Earth in the background. You say, hey, where do you think I am, guys? I'm on the moon. There's Earth. No, they didn't.
Well, they did in that one picture. The problem is the Earth's a tiny little marble in the sky, and then 10 pictures later, it's big. What is it? Is it small, is it big, or is it medium?
It depends who's doing the fabrication.
And what order they're doing it in.
Exactly. There were 9 missions that went to the moon between December 1968, Apollo 8, and December 1972, Apollo 17. There were quite a lot of missions, so there was a lot of photographs that needed to be created. They got a bit rushed. They didn't get it all done on time. Everybody panicked, and they got some of it wrong. And all we're doing is pointing out the things they got wrong. NASA will not front up to it. NASA will not say, okay, sorry, yeah, we got that wrong.
In 1969, they had no idea that in this day and age, everybody on the planet has availability to all of the documents, all of the photographs, with equipment that can view it in high-resolution detail, can zoom into individual items within a photograph, and be able to compare them, as many photographs as you want to compare with one another, right? They didn't know we had search tools that we could go through thousands of pages of documentation to find a single word. And if you want to find out where the Cannon Air Force Base was or anything else, you can just do a word search and go through a 1,000-page document, and it'll show you where every instance that it occurs in, right? They had no idea those kind of things would happen in 1969, that we had that availability to be able to do that, right? And that means when you're researching an item, even when I pull up the number of PDF files I've downloaded, right, and I'm looking for a particular item within there, right? I can't remember everything that I've read, but I can do a word search and go up there and it'll show me throughout that document the specific details I'm looking for. People didn't understand that. They're sitting there with big volume textbooks and everything else. You'd have to start it from start to finish and read the entire thing again to get the information that you really needed. We don't need to do that in this day and age. We can find that information instantly.
And because you have spent so many days, so many hours, weeks, months, years even, looking through it, you're probably as well informed about the Apollo missions, what they did, what they were said to have done, and what they should have done, as anybody here on Earth, let alone anybody working for NASA now, who starts from the point of view, oh, it's all real, these idiots don't know what they're talking about. You do know what you're talking about. You're not an idiot.
When you have somebody like Dave come up and he spends a couple hours or something to put his video together, and he grabs the first thing or he Googles something, and when he was coming up with it on the shadows in particular on the thing, some guy in Reddit did that. The double image came through the window, right? And so that's what he did. That's how he Googled it. He just put it up there and it shows up. So he's a parrot. He didn't actually take the photograph and take the time to look at it in detail.
No, he didn't. And it was quite obvious by what he was saying, because he wasn't saying the right things.
I learned so much from this just editing the videos, because I have to, first of all, get the soundtrack like we're doing now, and then smooth it all out, get the images and get the video, and then I look through it, because on the editor you blow it up and you can recolor it and sharpen it up a little bit, resize it, and then you start seeing things that don't make sense in those videos and photos. And then when you put that to the audio and you listen back a little bit and tweak things, and you're going, holy cow, this is something else. 30 minutes is 40 hours putting this together, and you see everything. You don't really miss anything. Now, of course, I've been wrong a few times, but if I'm wrong, I take the video down. Done with it. The thing is that when you look at these things and you see these things, you have to question them. And these guys don't. They don't question it and say, hey, could be something wrong here. Let's just take a look at this. But they're brainwashed, or they just don't seem to want to care. I really don't have an answer for that.
When people look at claiming about a double image going through a double pane of glass, you can get a double image shooting through a double pane of glass, but it has to be a reflection. You have to be on the same side where it's reflecting back at you to get that double image. You put a light source up like at nighttime in a light with a double pane of glass, and you have a light source up there, you can look through and you can see the reflection double image. But if you can see through it, it's transparent, so you can't get a double image of what's coming through the glass.
Right, and the only way that can happen is if the light source is outside of that window.
You'd have to be recording it reflecting back off the glass.
Right, and you could see that because you could see the camera from the inside shot and the outside shot.
You can't create a double image, whatever's lit outside, and you're shooting through a window. Your eyes aren't going to pick it up, the camera's not going to pick it up because the glass is transparent. And it doesn't matter whether there's a single one or a double glass or not, that doesn't do it. But on a reflection, where it's darker on the outside of the glass and you have a light inside, like at nighttime in your house, right? You get a reflection. You can see the double image comes back to you.
But the only time that the shadow is going to change from the left to the right is if that light source is outside and you're inside shooting out that glass. And that's exactly what we see.
It's a very selective explanation. You know, was it Dave was saying, well, it's a double pane of glass, therefore you'll get two images? Well, that's crap, because all the film of Apollo 11 was shot through the same window, and it's not a double image in sight. It's not a sensible explanation. It's not scientifically valid. And these people are so keen on their science, they just don't practice it. They practice pseudoscience.
The only way a shadow can move like that is if the light source is outside and you're inside shooting through that glass. And if that light source is moving, that shadow is going to move. And it does. It goes from the left to the right. And that is in Apollo 12 and it's in Apollo 14. Of course, Apollo 14 is the best, but it's still in Apollo 12. That shadow is moving.
But the secondary light source in there is very close and at a different angle, and it's only shooting at the lem. The main light source is coming down, illuminating the ground and everything else. The secondary light source is very, very close and more precise on the lamp. You can see that because otherwise you'd be getting in them little craters farther out. They'd be happening. That light source is focused right on the lamp itself.
Just one point on that, which I've seen people mention many times. If they were using two light sources, you would get two shadows. That's the normal statement made. Therefore, because they're not double shadows, they're not using two light sources. That's the normal explanation. So they come back to the way NASA does it. The point is that if you have two light sources on a subject, you'll have a main light source which illuminates the subject. You'll then have another light source filling in the shadow side of the object, which doesn't cast a shadow because the shadow is relatively weak compared to the power of the main light source. Therefore, right, you can get two light sources illuminating a subject. You will not get two shadows if you know what you're doing.
Depending where that light source could be pointing more upward.
It could be.
But it's not actually hitting the ground.
No, it's not.
It could be going straight across. And like I said, in 1969, no one could have imagined what we were capable of accessing in this day and age. And when they put out their official documents, when they put out their articles in the different magazines and textbooks and everything else and their original images, who the hell would question any of that?
Nobody.
But now that we have the capability to see all of it.
That's the major difference. Now, isn't it strange that you've got this wonderful story of man landing on the moon over 50 years ago, and they can't do it again. They can't get back again. They keep trying to launch their rocket, the SLS rocket. 3 times they've tried it, one goal. The technology within the computers that we use is so far advanced compared to what was available in the late 1960s, early 1970s. It's like a different universe, a different world, and you can do the research now.
If NASA had a computer, a guidance computer, and all of the other stuff that they claim that it was capable of doing, in 1969, IBM would have been out of business. There would have been no Apple computer because they were so far advanced. Can you imagine a file that could do all of those things on a 16 kilobit wire copper core block, 4-pound block of wood holding 16 kilobytes, able to do a guidance system in a 360-degree environment that is 10 times faster than a Tesla car is today, and all done on 16 kilobits of information. If you could write a software program that tiny in 1969 and operate that antiquated equipment to do anything on it, let alone be autonomous, even if it was manually operated from inputs from people off of keyboards and joysticks and everything else, that the computer was capable of doing that in 1969, IBM would have been put out of business completely. I mean, 2 guys getting high in a garage come up with a bloody computer, they'd be laughed out of stock. They just look at them and say, what, is that all it can do? And they had 7 years when they developed that computer to when Steve Jobs and Wozniak put that computer up, right? They had 7 years advance. That's just a lifetime. They're showing they're that capable. It took till, 2005 before they came up with a computer that was that capable.
Because they had to have the interim period to develop it. And Moore's law of computers, isn't it?
Well, it hasn't done that in the last 20 years.
It certainly did it at the beginning.
It did it at the beginning, absolutely. You bought a computer and it was an antique by the time you unboxed it. And you and I lived through that.
I've got one of the computers that were developed back in those days. It's an antique.
To make that claim that it could do that and then not produce a product for the commercial market. And that's what everything that they have claimed. The insulation that they had to protect their fuel tanks and everything else, the claims that they made on this very thin material should have insulated our houses.
Sensible idea.
The glass that they must have had on these vehicles to protect from micrometeors, I mean, why do they have to have 6-inch thick glass to protect the president or the Pope or whatever, right? when they had this really thin stuff that worked really, really well in 1969, and why isn't it on the market? Why did they not advance in their technology to take over the economic status of the world and maintain it? Those products never made it to the marketplace because they never existed.
That's the point. They never existed. We were told they existed. We were told stories about how they were able to do all these wonderful things because they had to have the stories so that people could believe the fabrication of Apollo. And they had to believe that fabrication because the Cold War, which was raging at the time, that was not a real event, was something that America needed to be seen to succeed in. And the only way they could be seen to succeed is if they had man on the moon. That was Kennedy's challenge. Place a man on the moon before the end of the decade and return him safely to the Earth.
You see the progression of NASA when they started. They needed to have a media presence, so they went to Walt Disney. The first productions of their media presentations were done there. Then where did they go? Well, they went to MIT and they got a bunch of so-called guys to sit there with their little bow ties on and look like they know something and do their little documentaries on it. Then what did they do? They built Downey Studios. By 1962, they had Downey Studios in full operation. Now they could do their own media presentations, their own simulations, everything else. And then Carl Sagan comes along, and they're using that studio to take his imagination of the universe went on screen. And now you've got Neil deGrasse Tyson doing the same thing. Whatever he's talking about, whatever is in his imagination is being presented to you as a visual image. And Cox is the same way when he does his series, right? That's what those studios are for. But they're also designed to do full simulations.
People say they saw the moon landings live on television. No, what you were watching live on television at the time were simulations in studios, CBS, NBC, ABC. They were doing simulations on screen. It was admitted they had simulation written on the frame. It was a simulation. You weren't watching real live, transmitted from the moon, TV images.
And NASA has the largest and most advanced film studios in the world.